Well, good evening and welcome to this special edition half hour of Reality Check. Tonight we're taking a look at what is really happening in the Republican Party in 2012. To the casual observer, it might look like a typical campaign season. A slew of Republican candidates at the beginning of the year started off the Republican race. If you remember that field of candidates, well, it looked like this. Businessman Herman Cain, Minnesota Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, Texas Governor Rick Perry, former Utah Governor John Huntsman, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. There was former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, Texas Congressman Ron Paul, former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum. And as you also know, the field has narrowed. Only weeks ago, we were down to just four: Romney, Santorum, Gingrich, and Paul. But it was in early April when Rick Santorum, who many of the pundits claimed was the real challenger to Romney, decided to suspend his campaign. Only a couple of weeks later, Gingrich did the same. Both candidates quickly endorsed Mitt Romney, which meant we were down to just these two. But according to the national media, that really wasn't the case. We were actually down to one: former Governor Romney. The media saying that he was the presumptive nominee. But what the national media has not told the public is that the Republican race is not won through a series of state contests. It's won by accumulating delegates at state conventions. Those delegates go on to vote for the nominee at the Republican National Convention in Tampa. And as a result, the national media has ignored two very important facts about the Republican race. Let's take a look. The first fact here: even though former Governor Mitt Romney has won many of these beauty contests, he's actually only won a few hundred delegates. That's because the majority of states have not yet held their state conventions to choose delegates. Now, that's not to say that Romney will not be the Republican nominee. He very well may be, but he's not yet. The other fact that they have ignored is that in the states that have held their contests, Texas Congressman Ron Paul is winning large numbers of delegates, and that is leading to massive fights at state conventions across the country. It's also leading many people to take over the GOP leadership in a number of these states, and those people happen to be Paul's supporters. That has also led to Governor Mitt Romney creating a shadow party in some of these states. We're going to get to all of that in just a moment, break it down for you. But before we do, you may be watching and saying to yourself, what are you talking about? Earlier this week, Ron Paul ended his campaign, didn't he? After all, that was the headline on newspapers and TV stations across the country. It was all over Twitter. Ron Paul drops out. But is it true? Tonight, we begin there. Well, the articles have been everywhere, from Fox News to the LA Times, the AP, even Newsmax. Paul is out. Ron Paul drops out. The headlines are pretty clear, but they are wrong. The actual statement from the Paul campaign explains that Congressman Paul will no longer actively campaign in remaining 11 primaries. That includes Texas, California, and New Jersey, states where TV buys are very expensive. So doesn't that mean the campaign is over? Well, if you watch Reality Check often, then you, better than most, know that's not at all true. In the case of the Washington Times article cited by the Drudge Report, it goes on to explain something that most people might not even understand. Mr. Paul said he will continue to work to win delegates in states that have already voted and where the process of delegate selection is playing out. So what is the strategy here? Well, it's pretty simple. Between now and the end of June, most states will select their national delegates for Tampa. And it's in the fight for these delegates where the nomination will be won or lost. Case in point, this past weekend, two big contests were held in Arizona and in Oklahoma. Arizona has 29 delegates, Oklahoma 43. Let's start with Arizona, which was won in the primary by Romney. But the majority of people who showed up on Saturday for the delegate caucus, well, they were Paul supporters, and things got pretty ugly. Reports on Saturday night were that Paul took 11 of 18 delegates decided in the district caucuses. The remaining 11 at-large delegates, well, they were left up in the air. You see, the Romney forces, they stalled for hours, but Romney supporters got so tired of waiting, they finally began to leave the convention. In a last-ditch effort, the Romney forces tried to declare there was now no quorum, and other motions were offered. When a vote for the at-large delegates was finally taken, instead of being read aloud, it was sealed, put under lock and key with a promise that GOP leadership tomorrow would count those and sort things out. Took them 3 days to count those, and the list finally emerged. Now we know Paul has only 3 delegates and Romney 26. People in Arizona not very happy. Then you had a convention in Oklahoma. Santorum and Romney forces united to shut out the Ron Paul people at the Oklahoma State GOP convention. By some estimates, Ron Paul supporters were a majority on the floor of the convention and thus should have walked away with another win. More than half of the people attending the convention were Paul supporters. The GOP leadership in this case, they delayed the caucus. They cited their own clerical errors. And then on the premise that the time for the convention hall rental was coming to an end, they refused to hold a final vote on credentials or to acknowledge the calls for a roll call vote on the delegates or the alternates. And that's required under the rules. Finally, they moved to dismiss. So the convention was moved outside and continued in a parking lot across the street.
Basically, we decided to hold what's called a rump convention, and we took our contingent outside, and we redid all the business of the convention, and we've got results to show for that, including nominations of delegates and alternates to the National Convention.
Keep in mind, during the earlier meeting, the GOP in Oklahoma did not conclude business, nor did they elect the delegates properly. The folks from Oklahoma who continued the convention afterward, well, they tell me everything was done according to the rules, and their slate of delegates is legit. So here's what you need to know. Oklahoma delegates from the Paul side, they are filing a legal challenge and now saying that they plan to go to Tampa regardless because they won't be cheated out of their vote. And that's been the same story from one state to the next. Listen, if you assume that the AP narrative of Romney being only 200 delegates away from the nomination at this point is true, well, then you just might be in for a surprise come August. And that is Reality Check. So clearly, Congressman Paul, not out of the race just yet. And with state conventions in Georgia, Minnesota, Michigan, and Mississippi this weekend, things could be very interesting. Interesting enough that the RNC and Mitt Romney now setting up what are called shadow parties in states where the GOP leadership is now no longer run by the establishment. So what exactly is a shadow party? And why would that be necessary? I'll tell you after the break. And welcome back to this Reality Check half-hour special. Tonight we're looking at the fight for the Republican Party and how this year's primary is about more than just one election. Before the break, we told you how the fight for delegates in the Republican primary is far from over. In fact, it is causing the kind of internal struggle the Republican Party has not seen in at least 20 years. The fight from state to state so intense now that, in fact, in one state, Nevada, the Romney campaign has decided to create a shadow party. When Nevada held its Republican state convention 2 weeks ago, Ron Paul supporters, they swept the delegates there, winning 22 of the 25 available delegates. Then many of the leadership positions in the Clark County GOP, well, they were also won by Paul supporters. And that led to an official censure of the RNC chairman, Ryan Priebus. According to the Las Vegas Sun, Priebus says he was disappointed with that censuring. Again, according to the Sun, Priebus, along with the Romney folks, though, have now decided to turn the so-called Team Nevada office for Romney into a de facto Republican Party. The article goes on to say this, quote, "The goal is for us to be running, get out the vote, running phone programs, voter ID, voter contact, everything through the Team Nevada headquarters," that strategist told the reporter from the Sun. That is, they say, everything the party is supposed to do, except the GOP here can't raise money and has the inmates running the asylum. The plan would be to transfer money directly to Team Nevada. The GOP insider said, quote, "Essentially, we are setting up a shadow state party." So why set up that shadow state party? Because what the Republican National Committee did not see coming at the beginning of this election is what is being referred to as the Liberty Movement. Ron Paul supporters are not just supporting a candidate. Congressman Paul, in many ways, is just a messenger. So what is the message? Well, it's one of small government, of fiscal responsibility, returning to the Constitution as rule of law, restoring individual liberty, and ending interventionist wars, among other things. What the national media is not telling you is that not only is Congressman Ron Paul winning delegates as state contests are being held, but according to the American Conservative magazine, quote, Paul supporters are now state party chairs in Iowa, Alaska, and Nevada. They have made inroads from Maine to Louisiana. These gains do not evaporate the minute the presidential campaign ends. So here's what we know. In at least 5 states so far, the Ron Paul Liberty fringe people, well, they're no longer just a fringe. Despite what the national media or the RNC is telling you, these people are now the leadership in many states. And it is in the inroads that they're making, as the American Conservative pointed out, that have ramifications for the party far beyond August in Tampa. And it is the message of former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin referring to in a recent interview with Fox's Sean Hannity. Listen.
convincement, Ronnie, is it now? Do you think it's pretty much over?
Well, let me put it this way. I don't want Newt to drop out. I don't want Ron Paul to drop out because I want debate still on the ideas that both of the other candidates have been able to espouse and explain to the country. I want Ron Paul's message about cutting the budget, about the economic woeful times that we are in and what we can do about it. I want those to continue to be discussed, and Newt has some good ideas. We have all of these problems that have got to be faced as one united America. We have got to get back to the Constitution being the blueprint towards that more perfect union. And if we elect constitutional, common sense conservatives who understand that government is not the answer.
Clearly, there is a bigger narrative here than just this one presidential primary election. But what about this primary? Is this contest still up in the air? Can Congressman Paul mathematically pick up enough delegates to win the convention? Well, in a word, yes. And that's because of a little-known rule in the Republican Party that allows delegates to vote their conscience. I'm going to tell you all about that and why it's taking place. Well, it's reportedly sending the Romney campaign into a panic at this point when we come back. Well, welcome back to this Reality Check half-hour special. Before the break, I explained how the Paul campaign strategy has been to pick up as many delegates as possible. So what happens when you grab up all of these delegates? Do they get to do whatever they want, or don't they have to vote the way that the state leadership tells them to? As I told you a little over a week ago, one of the big secrets of this primary has been that delegates are actually free agents. The issue at hand, our reality check on Rule 38 of the Republican National Convention rules. As I told you last week, way down at the end of the RNC rules is rule number 38. That rule consists of only one sentence. No delegate or alternate delegate shall be bound by any attempt of any state or congressional district to impose the unit rule. So what is the unit rule? Well, that rule requires that all delegates from one state or congressional district are required or bound to vote as a unit. After that story aired, a blog post titled "Urgent, Ben Swann and Matt Larson are wrong about Rule 38 and delegates being unbound based on RNC rules." Now, the author here does a good job of raising some very valid points. At the heart of his argument, the states get around this rule by not binding the entire group of delegates. They always have at least one delegate unbound, and it's usually 3 unbound delegates. So they are not enforcing a unit rule in any way. Therefore, Rule 38 does not apply to the argument. And that is true. For instance, in Ohio, we have 66 delegates, and they are bound delegates. But of those 66, there are 3 RNC delegates who have the freedom to vote however they choose. Therefore, the blogger correctly states that this allows the RNC to get around the unit rule. But the blogger may not be entirely correct. I stand by our argument that it very well may be that none of the delegates, when they reach the Republican National Convention, are actually bound. And it isn't just our theory. An extensive article at fairvote.org has taken a very close look at this issue. And the truly important issue is this. The author states that the RNC rules provision on the unit rule make it clear that delegates are not bound to vote according to how most delegates from their state are voting. They go on to say delegates can vote according to their own judgment and conscience. So, what is all of this based on? Actually, it's not our interpretation of the RNC rules or fairvote.org's interpretation. It is the interpretation of the RNC legal counsel. Jennifer Sheehan, legal counsel for the RNC, plainly stated in a letter to Nancy Lord, Utah National Committee woman, several weeks before the convention, the RNC does not recognize a state's binding of national delegates, but considers each delegate a free agent who can vote for whoever they choose. And the National Convention allows delegates to vote for the individual of their choice, regardless of whether the person's name is officially placed into nomination or not. And that statement is about as clear as it gets. The delegate process was actually designed to entrust a group of voters with the power to override the popular vote in each state in order to ensure that the best candidate is chosen. Now, keep in mind, the Republican and the Democratic parties are not government agencies. They're private organizations, more like clubs. So voting within a party is not bound by election law. And that's what you need to know. The national media isn't telling you something very important. This past weekend, Congressman Ron Paul swept the delegates in 2 states, in Nevada and in Maine. At this point, all the delegate momentum appears to be on his side. So, much of what we've been telling you for months has now finally been mentioned by several national outlets. Bloomberg Business, U.S. News and World Report, even radio host Mark Levin this week have finally started to hint at the idea that, well, maybe Tampa isn't going to be inevitable after all. Stay tuned. And that is Reality Check. And of course, inevitable for neither candidate. So what if Congressman Paul does not pull an upset? If there isn't a broker convention in Tampa, there very well may not be. Well, there is a bigger story happening here that the national media is not telling you. Why you should not focus only on the presidential race, but realize that Ron Paul may be taking over the Republican Party. Could that possibly be true? It may be the biggest untold story of this election cycle. Until now, next. Welcome back. Earlier in this special, we talked about the RNC and the Mitt Romney campaign setting up a shadow party in Nevada. The reason for that tactic is pretty simple, because what the national media is not telling you is that there is a bigger fight here for more than just one Republican primary. So just to make the point clear, the Iowa GOP State Central Committee now has 6 members who have publicly expressed support for Ron Paul's candidacy, and that includes the new state chair of the Iowa Republican Party, A.J. Spiker, the former vice chairman for the Paul campaign in Iowa. Ron Paul supporters have also taken over the GOP in Louisiana, with not a bare majority, but a whopping 74% of the delegates to Louisiana State Convention in June. It's the same story in Alaska, where the Paul movement took over the Republican Party State Convention. They elected 2 Paul supporters to positions of state chair and co-chair. In Nevada, Paul supporters also elected to lead the state Republican Party. And in Maine, the same story, where 2 Paul supporters elected to the Republican National Committee, as well as a number of positions within the GOP leadership. Which is why in an article titled, "Forget the Nomination, Ron Paul's Revolution is Taking Over the Republican Party," W.E. Nussmore writes this. He writes, quote, "Whether media commentators consider this change a good or bad thing for the Republican Party and for the future of American politics, they have an obligation to report it to their audiences and to acknowledge just how significant this change is. We are witnessing no less than a political revolution in the country and a major shift in the GOP's internal composition. For 2 election cycles now, Paul supporters were an outside minority that had to make their case to the party establishment. It looks like in 2014 and 2016, Republican candidates will have to make their case to Ron Paul supporters in many places." And that is exactly why Reality Check is covering this primary the way that we are. Too often people believe that our goal here is to promote the campaign of one person, Congressman Paul, or to work to derail the campaign of Governor Romney, and both ideas are simply incorrect. The goal here is to make sure that we are honestly covering what is, in reality, the biggest story of this presidential primary season. In the late 1980s, evangelical Christians began to make their voices heard in politics. It took the media a while to catch up, not realizing that this fringe group was about to take over the Republican Party. It did. Today, candidates can forget about winning the nomination of the party without that evangelical vote. And the same thing is happening again. The media, once again, they don't see it. There is a new fight for the Republican Party, one that will likely turn the grand old party, well, into a whole new party. Thanks for joining us tonight. Those here in Cincinnati, as well as viewers watching our live stream here in the U.S. and around the world. And don't forget, we're always on at fox19.com. Good night.